Welcome, NutritionRadio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, University Nutrition Professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in. Market news from the food world. Hey, everybody. Well, I've got a little story for you today, sort of a rant about food markets. This is filled into other categories as well. But I was in a coffee shop in a local college town with my wife recently, and as is so typical these days, they flipped around a little tablet screen which gave me 3 options for tips. Pretty big tips, as it turns out. But I chose a generous tip, maybe 30%. It was a new coffee shop to me. I thought, why not? I like the environment. And then we waited. And we waited. And about 15 minutes later, mind you, with my wife leaning on a cane, somebody came out of the back room and said, "Hey, have you guys been waited on?" And I said, "Yes, we have. I just wanted an Americano. My wife wanted a latte or something fairly simple. And yeah, we're still waiting." On top of this poor service, my Americano kind of sucked. It was sour. I understand that certain roasts and beans, I believe like Ethiopian beans, have a quote-unquote brighter taste and that sort of thing. But I just didn't really like it. As we walked out, I commented to my wife about the tipping in advance. This is the problem with tipping in advance, especially because I thought I was being generous. I know 30% of maybe a $8 or $9 charge is not that big a deal, but it was a mistake. To me, tipping is gratuity, right? Showing gratitude for someone going above and beyond in customer service or quality of product or both. But that brings us to today's news. This first piece is from Business Insider from May 8th of this year. It's spanking new. Will Gendron. Customers are being asked to tip even at self-checkout. Some say it's emotional blackmail. This little piece begins by saying self-checkout machines at cafes, sports stadiums, and airports are asking for tips, and customers aren't happy about giving extra money to machines. The Wall Street Journal reported how customers have responded to these tip prompts. The majority said tip cues were confusing, and many were unsure where the money was going. I don't know if you can identify with this, but this is very much in line with what I just experienced. This Business Insider piece from earlier this month has a couple of quotes and examples. It says a traveler who was prompted to include a 10% to 20% tip on a $6 bottle of water at a gift shop in an airport described the ask as being, quote, a bit of emotional blackmail. The author of this piece here, Will, says many Americans are experiencing tipping fatigue as they get asked to tip more at more places and face the effects of inflation. It is a double whammy. The last bit of this article that I have here says a spokesperson from the payment platform Block told Business Insider that total tips received by full-service restaurants were up 16.5% in the fourth quarter of 2022 compared to a year earlier, and nearly that much in quick service restaurants like coffee shops. Now that latter one does get me. I mean, should I tip someone for pouring my coffee? I am paying retail price for that product that he's sliding across the counter to me. I do want to support baristas and that sort of thing, especially if they're really doing some artistry. But again, tipping in advance in quick service settings where there's really not a waiter or waitress, it does make you scratch your head. Or maybe I'm just being old. Partly for the podcast, I decided to look it up, and I found another recent article from CNBC, over 2.5 million views from March 30th of this year, why tipping is so out of control in the U.S. And I do think this is a U.S.-centric phenomenon. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all in Europe, but when I've traveled, sometimes I'm confused about when do I tip and when do I not. And here, man, they're jamming it right in your face with the tablet. Tip 10, 20, or even 30%. CNBC piece says tipping in the United States is on the rise and experts are calling it tip-flation. It gives some similar data about the rise in tipping, right? Tip frequency or tip amount. And they say it's partly because of newer and sleeker looking point of sale systems like Square, Toast, and Clover, who have also increased their sales as a result. Now, this is one of those technological advancements. I'm not sure this is a good thing for the food industry like some of the other scientific technological advancements that I've talked about in weeks past. The CNBC piece says after consumers swipe their credit card, they're typically prompted with 3 large tipping options on a screen. While businesses can opt out of tipping feature, most aren't. In fact, even Starbucks started doing this in September of 2022. With Americans being pressured to tip higher percentages and for more services, the question is, where is the tipping point? But bad puns aside, it says tipping culture has gotten out of control, and they have some examples here. This is from a video. I get up to a pay window, and she's like, how much do you want to tip? What am I going to tip for? I'm in a drive-thru. Example really struck home with me because this happened to me at a local pizza place. This was months ago, but it happened repeatedly, where they would present me with a little clipboard and highlight not one, but multiple areas where a tip was called for. And I would stubbornly not do it. I would put NA. It's not applicable. I'm at a drive-thru window. But this is something that because of the electronic tablets, it's really gotten worse, right? Because they give you specific numerical tips, a percent or a dollar tip amount. It's ridiculous. Or at least that's my perspective. You can leave a comment on YouTube, Lawnman07, if you disagree. But to me, it's a drive-through. There's no wait staff per se. I paid full retail price for that pizza. To me, that was the deal. That was the sort of social contract. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand that in the U.S., many states, most states by far, can pay employees less than minimum wage because they're sort of assuming they're going to more than make up for it with tips. But again, when I make that kind of tip, I'm not sure if the employees are going to get it. It's not quite the same thing as a tip jar where I actively put some money in, or maybe I just choose to omit to do so, either because I don't have the change on me right then, or, it just didn't seem appropriate and really nobody notices or cares. Actually, that is brought up in the CNBC piece. It says with these new tablets, what has happened is they've turned what used to be a sin of omission, like I simply didn't put money into the tip jar, into a sin of commission. You're actually committing something wrong because you have to hit a button and say no, right, to opt out. And you're doing that in front of the barista or the cashier person or the person that you're with or the line of people behind you. I can see why people could feel a sense of pressure. Again, this piece reinforces something that I mentioned earlier. TIP stands for to ensure promptness. That makes sense to me. Again, it's sort of that idea of gratitude for something to be prompt and above the call of duty. One theory was that it evolved in eating and drinking establishments as a way to forestall some envy, this article says, in that the person that's actually working isn't having all the fun that you're having, so you give them a little bit of tip to try to compensate for that on some level. Two last points here from this piece. One is that consumer tips soared during the pandemic. I'm not surprised at that, right? We lost a lot of face-to-face kind of interactions. A lot of people started looking for tips, including electronic ways to try to make up for lost wages, and people were feeling a certain sense of, I guess you could call it charity, in that they wanted to help their fellow man, fellow woman. That, however, it's not here anymore, and the amounts of tips in these electronic tablets that are in your face, they haven't really changed much. They're still up there in your face asking for sometimes kind of large tips, even in situations that historically haven't called for them. And the last point is they're being asked, consumers that is, to tip prior to service completion, and doing so beforehand is almost like a bribe, according to the people in this video, leaving a person afraid not to tip because maybe the worker will do less good work, right? You don't want to be concerned about a barista's perception of their tip as they prepare your latte, and this is an example that they use, not me. But point taken. According to a 2022 creditcards.com survey, 22% of respondents said that when they're presented with various suggested tip prompts, they feel pressured to tip more than they normally would. And again, this is where the electronic and the tablet portion of it, although I can see some good sides to this can become a problem. And just to wrap up here, I think I'm probably unlike a lot of Americans who want to do away with tipping entirely. I do think that the extent of pandemic goodwill might have ebbed a little bit, but keeping this focused on the food industry, which is today's theme, I still do tip. I do a bit less. When I see those prompts that are in front of me, sometimes I choose the least one. If I'm just getting a cup of coffee, and I do this every single day, mind you, this is in advance. I just think that maybe that's the best approach for me right now, instead of caving to pressure to give that 25 or 30% tip. I guess I'll keep some faith that it is in fact going to the employees that need it, underpaid oftentimes employees that need it. And I get it that the company that's providing the tech service, the tablet, they deserve some small cut in order to make this happen a little bit more smoothly. But let me know what you think. I gave you the information about where you can do that in the past. I appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you later. The NutritionRadio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.